Welcome, everyone. I'm Ashley Williams-Clark, Vice President and Director of the Center for Equity, Engagement, and Research here at DFC. Thank you so much for joining our Lunch and Learn webinar for our latest report, Growth Occupations, Opportunities for More Equitable Participation in Detroit's Growing Economy. We are so excited to share the findings from DFC's latest report and to bring innovative ideas and solutions from people doing work on this topic, both locally and nationally. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special note of appreciation to the Center Project team, Edward Lynch, Kendall Nash, and Shari Williams, who all played important roles in developing this report, and to our research partner, Alan Berube from Brookings Metro, and Eli Barley Duke, who was formerly at Brookings, and to the Kellogg Foundation, whose support made this research possible, and to our Research Advisory Committee, whose expertise, experience, and commitment to this topic strengthened and informed our work. So just a little housekeeping before we get started. I'd like to encourage everyone to follow DFC on social media and to share and engage with the information using DFC's social media hashtag DFC Ideas. Also, we have printed copies of the report available for free. Please use the link in the chat to request as many copies as you need, and we will gladly mail them to you. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our President and CEO, Anika Goss, up to the virtual stage to provide some opening remarks.
Thank you, Ashley. Good afternoon, everyone. I am so excited to welcome you to the Lunch and Learn today. I am really excited about this session. Like you, I've watched Detroit grow and change economically. New investment, job announcements, new companies, and people moving to Detroit. But what's not clear is who is benefiting from all of this new investment. It's even more concerning is that the only jobs that we know that are growing in Detroit are low-wage jobs. And while there are promises of pathway jobs and other upskilling and other opportunities, those paths don't always seem to be clear. And what is clear is that Detroiters are viewed by the majority investors and industry as low-wage talent. And that has to stop. You're going to hear today from the business community, from the public sector, from private philanthropy and others on how to make those pathways clearer. And to me, that conversation is one that we haven't had before. And I'm going to be listening along with everybody else, looking for solutions, looking for ways that we can make those opportunities clearer. So before we begin, I just want to personally thank the Kellogg Foundation for believing in us in this research and bringing all of us together. And a particular thanks to the Brookings Metropolitan Program for partnering with us on this important research. I want to introduce Faye Nelson and begin to bring her up to the virtual stage. Faye Nelson is the Director of Michigan Programs at the W.K. Kellogg Foundation in Battle Creek. In this role, Faye provides leadership and oversight of the Foundation's investments in Michigan to create conditions that ensure children have opportunities to thrive in equitable communities. Based in the Kellogg Foundation's Detroit office, Faye leads the Foundation's statewide grant banking priorities in collaboration and partnership with grantees, communities, and other stakeholders throughout the region. Faye is a longtime Detroiter and a champion for Detroit. And so we're just so excited that she can join us today. So I'm gonna, without further ado, turn it over to Faye Nelson for her remarks. Faye.
Anika, thank you so much for that most generous and kind introduction. And good morning to you all. I am so pleased to be joining you today, representing the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, where children are at the heart of everything that we do. We know that children live in families and families live in communities. And in order for children to thrive, their families have to be able to support them, and their communities need to be equitable places of opportunity. And by many metrics, low unemployment and an increase in well-paying jobs and fast-growing industries, among them Detroit and Southeast Michigan, are moving in the right direction. New jobs that pay well provide access to career pathways and a door to the middle class for residents. However, this significant regional economic expansion has not been experienced equitably, especially for legacy Detroiters and people of color. Access to the middle class is especially important for Detroiters who have a per capita annual income of roughly $20,000 and a consistently high poverty rate of approximately 30%. Building a strong middle class and a more equitable future economically is paramount for the well-being of our region. The only way we can get there is by working together. Our strategy needs to be multifaceted with opportunities identified at both the system and individual levels. Our most vulnerable Detroiters need to be assisted in attaining new skills and credentials, and barriers removed to employment, such as the lack of access to high-quality childcare. We should also focus on creating jobs that provide pathways to careers and meaningful employment opportunities by supporting business growth and inclusive economic development efforts. Employers should continue to be encouraged to develop and/or equitable hiring and advancement practices, all while creating welcoming workplace environments. And finally, a more cohesive, accessible data system will allow us to better understand challenges and opportunities at both the individual and population levels. The report, which we are pleased to have supported here at the Kellogg Foundation, offers a wealth of excellent information, a platform to have important conversations, working with partners and identifying opportunities to address the challenges that are representative in this material. And now I'm very pleased to pass the microphone over to Shari Williams, Senior Program Manager with the Center for Equity, Engagement, and Research at Detroit Future City. Shari designs and implements community engagement strategies to ensure the inclusion of community voice in all Detroit Future City initiatives. The floor is yours, Shari.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Faye. I'm moved just hearing your words today. But I'm also super excited to transition us to the next portion of this event, where we will introduce the Growth Occupation Report, which was authored by Edward Lynch and Kendall Nash of Detroit Future City. We'll set some national context and then also walk you all through the data, in which you'll hear from two of our research team members, Alan Berube and Ashley Williams Clark. Alan is Interim Vice President and Director of Brookings Metro. In this capacity, he leads Brookings Metro in his mission to collaborate with local leaders to transform original research insights into policy and practical solutions that scale nationally, creating more prosperous, just, and resilient communities. Alan was an integral part of this project and is going to share a little bit about what Brookings Metro is doing to examine economic performance of 192 metro areas in the country across 5 broad performance categories. Alan, I welcome you to the stage.
Thank you so much, Shari. So Shari noted, I'm Alan Berube. I serve as the interim director at Brookings Metro. That's the division of the Brookings Institution public policy think tank in Washington, D.C. that focuses on the health of our cities and our regions. However, I'm glad to be joining you today from here at Techtown, Detroit. We were so fortunate to get to partner with Detroit Future City on this project, in part because it gets to the heart of our organization's vision, which Shari just outlined, that every community can be prosperous, just, and resilient, no matter its starting point. And it aligns with our mission, which Shari also just described, which involves testing our research insights in partnership with local leaders to design policy solutions that advance the vision. So one way that Brookings Metro measures our nation's progress towards that vision is through an annual index we publish called the Metro Monitor. And each year it takes stock of how US metropolitan economies are performing in three basic areas that add up to a definition of what we call inclusive growth. So the Metro Monitor first assesses growth, whether our regional economies are growing and expanding opportunities for workers and businesses. Second, it assesses prosperity, whether those regional economies are growing in their average value by creating good jobs and successful businesses that raise productivity and overall standards of living. And then third, and importantly, it assesses inclusion, whether the product of growth and prosperity is helping to create opportunity for all that narrows regional disparities by income, race, and place. So we released the most recent edition of the Metro Monitor Index just last week. And this year's edition places a special focus on patterns of inclusive growth in metro areas before the COVID-19 pandemic, so from the years 2011 to 2019, and then through the first 2 years of the pandemic, from 2019 to 2021, that's the most recent year for which we have complete data. So if we advance to the next slide, I want to show you that the new data revealed some warning signs for Metro Detroit. We click and show the pre-pandemic pattern. On many of the Metro Monitor's core indicators, the region was actually an average to above average performer among the nation's 192 major metro areas from 2011 to 2019. It was delivering quality job growth that raised living standards and the overall employment rate, and actually was managing to do so in a way that narrowed disparities in employment and earnings by race, more so than most other metro areas in our sample. But now if we click through to the pandemic patterns, as Metro Detroit entered and then began to emerge from the economic crisis that the COVID-19 pandemic precipitated, it plummeted in the rankings on these indicators. No metro area, I want to be clear, was spared the economic impacts of the pandemic, but Metro Detroit felt them worse than most. Job recovery in this region has not been as robust as in many of its peers. The share of the region's workers in jobs didn't bounce back quite as strongly. And the pandemic widened disparities in employment and earnings by race, which, despite some progress before the pandemic, even remained stark at that point. In these respects, actually, Metro Detroit was like a lot of other large metro areas around the country. Big cities like Boston and Chicago, Houston, and Los Angeles, they were hit earlier and harder by the pandemic, and new patterns of hybrid and remote work are complicating their path to full recovery. But Metro Detroit is also distinct from these places, particularly in its demographic and spatial makeup. Larger segments of this region's population, particularly its Black and Brown communities, and larger geographic swaths of the region, particularly the city of Detroit, face more extreme exclusion from economic opportunity than elsewhere. And those patterns ultimately exert a drag on the region's ability to generate good growth, higher living standards, and broad-based economic opportunity. So the next slide highlights that as Detroit continues to emerge from this crisis, this project on growth occupations, I think, poses and begins to answer a series of very key questions for public and private sector decision makers in this region. First, where are the best opportunities to recapture quality job growth that raises the region's living standards? Second, what specific kinds of good jobs can fuel that growth based on trends prior to the pandemic here and in Detroit's peer regions across the country? And then third, what strategies can ensure that access to these good jobs is truly equitable and thereby narrows longstanding economic disparities by race and by place? We were very honored to partner with a great team here at Detroit Future City on this new report, and they were led by our next presenter, Ashley Williams-Clark. Ashley is a vice president at Detroit Future City, and she is director of its Center for Equity, Engagement, and Research. She'll introduce the findings from our joint research on growth occupations and its key implications for the local and regional leaders that make so much of what this region does possible. So without further ado, over to you, Ashley.
Thank you so much, Alan. And with that, I'm excited to share more with you about the findings from our report. So as Alan noted, as we think about our growing economy and an inclusive economy, It's paramount that Detroiters and people of color are part of that growth. And as both him and Anika and Faye mentioned, this inspired the need to identify what are the emerging growth occupations, jobs that are growing, that are good paying, and helping to power the overall expansion of the regional economy. To build an inclusive and prosperous city and region, Detroiters need to be able to fully and fairly participate in the region's economy. And connecting more of the region's workers to these growth occupations, especially Black and Latino workers and those who live in the city of Detroit, could be a powerful way to ensure more robust economic outcomes and serve as a critical part of the region's equitable path forward. So there are three things we're going to talk about. We are going to be identifying what are the growth occupations. We're going to look at who has access to these growth occupations. And then we're going to talk about some solutions that we could explore and implement for creating more equitable access to these growing occupations. So first, working with Brookings Metro, we identified a criteria for what qualifies as a growth occupation. For a growth occupation to be the backbone of building economic equity in the region, they have to be jobs that are not only fueling growth in the Detroit metro region, but also jobs that have a critical mass of employment and provide workers with a good middle-class wage. So to that end, we looked at 4 different criteria. First, they had to have a rate of job growth that was the same or greater than the region as a whole between 2014 and 2019, so pre-pandemic. At the same time, and during that time period, we needed to see a growth in wages after adjusting for inflation. Third, we looked at occupations that paid at least a middle-class wage. This is defined as occupations with a median wage of $25 per hour or more in 2019. And this really aims to focus attention on occupations that can provide a promising entry point into the middle class. And then lastly, we looked at jobs that are employing at least 300 people in the Detroit metro region. Using this definition, we found 107 growth occupations that are powering regional growth. What we found is that these growth occupations account for 1 in 4 total jobs in Metro Detroit, but they have been responsible for more than half, or 62%, of recent job growth. And this set of occupations has also proven to be particularly resilient in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. Jobs in the region's growth occupations were only responsible for 9% of the region's job losses in the first year of the pandemic, yet represented nearly half of the jobs gained in the second year of the pandemic. So what are these occupations? The top 10 largest growth occupations are shown on your screen, and collectively, these account for 42% of all of growth occupation employment. These 10 occupations also pay relatively well, with many paying a median wage of more than $35 per hour or $73,000 per year, a wage that is sufficient to move a household into the middle class. And these growing occupations exist in all areas of the economy, but roughly 2/3 of the total growth occupations in the region are concentrated within one of 3 major fields: management, business and finance, healthcare, and computer engineering and science, or STEM fields. And beyond the specifics of each growth occupation, it's also important to consider the industry sectors that these growth occupations are concentrated in. Industry sectors are important for identifying the types of businesses that could be targeted to increase the number of jobs in growth occupations. So for example, growth occupation jobs in fields like business, technology, sales, those can be found across a variety of sectors. So as we think about job attraction, where are we going to have the biggest bang for our buck? In Metro Detroit, 3 out of every 4 growth occupation jobs are located within one of these 7 industry sectors. The highest concentrations of growth occupation employment are in the healthcare and manufacturing industries, which together account for 1/3 of growth occupation employment and 35% of the region's total employment. But who has access to these occupations? One of our core things that we focus on is the fact that full and fair occupation in growth occupations, especially for Black Detroiters, is critical for wealth building and strengthening Detroit's middle class. So do they have access? What we found is that compared to the region as a whole, where 24% of workers are in growth occupations, we found that Black and Latino workers in the region are less likely to work in growth occupations, with only 16% of Black and 18% of Latino and Hispanic workers employed in growth occupations. In contrast, white and Asian workers are more likely than average to work these jobs, with 26% of white workers and 30% of Asian workers in growth occupations. Race and place also interact in shaping access to growth occupations. So while Black and Latino residents of the Detroit region are less likely overall to work in growth occupations, this is even more true for Black and Latino residents of the city of Detroit, which you can see here in the light blue compared to the rest of the Detroit region. Only 13% of Black and Latino workers who live in Detroit are employed in growth occupations, far below the regional average of 24%, and below their Black and Latino counterparts in the region. This is not the case for white residents of Detroit, who are more likely to work in growth occupations than white residents in the surrounding region. There are also substantial disparities in access to growth occupations based on a worker's educational attainment. So as a worker's education increases, so does the likelihood that they are employed in a growth occupation. 36% of workers with a bachelor's degree are in a growth occupation, which is twice as high compared to someone with only some college, 18% of which are in growth occupations. And it's 4 times as likely compared to somebody without a high school diploma. That being said, the majority of Metro Detroiters who work in growth occupations do not possess a 4-year degree. In fact, about 1/4 of growth occupation workers have only some post-secondary experience, and 15% have only a high school diploma. This suggests that there are, in fact, opportunities for workers without a college degree to access growth occupations, and in doing so, have a pathway into the middle class. That being said, there still needs to be an emphasis on increasing educational attainment so that more workers have access to and can grow within these growth occupations. But educational attainment doesn't explain all of why we see these disparities, and it doesn't eliminate these disparities. When we look at this by race and education, we find that at every level of educational attainment in Metro Detroit, Black workers remain significantly less likely than white workers to be employed in growth occupations. For instance, among workers with some post-secondary experience but no bachelor's degree, 1 in 5 white workers is in a growth occupation, compared to only 1 in 8 Black workers. These differences decrease slightly at higher levels of educational attainment, but they still persist. There is a 5 percentage point difference between Black and white bachelor's degree holders. We also know that other factors that are harder to measure, such as racial bias and related occupational segregation, which is the overrepresentation of certain demographic groups and occupations, play important roles too. But at the core of this, what is important to remember is that these disparities amount to missed opportunities to build our middle class overall, and especially our Black middle class. So one of the things we did is we also looked at peer regions to see where might there be opportunities for future growth. We looked at 3 peer regions. We looked at Atlanta, Indianapolis, and Columbus to see how Detroit compares and to also see what opportunities there may be in those places that could lend insights here into Detroit. And there are several occupations that we found that are growth occupations in our peer regions, but they didn't qualify quite yet as growth occupations in Detroit, largely because they haven't been growing fast enough recently. But of these peer metro growth occupations, there were 7, which you see on the screen, that already employ significant shares of Black and Latino workers in Metro Detroit and pay good wages. As with Detroit's growth occupations overall, jobs in management, business, and finance, as well as healthcare and technology, figure prominently among this group of occupations. And these jobs registered positive employment growth in the Detroit region in the late 2010s, and their momentum in peer metro regions suggests there could be an opportunity to cultivate a more robust and diverse pipeline of workers for these types of jobs, which could grow in the near future. So to summarize our key data takeaways, growth occupations, these are well-paying jobs, and their persistent growth during recent economic contractions suggests that they will continue to be resilient in the future. Secondly, we found disparities in who has access. We found that there are disparities in access to growth occupations based on race, geographic location, and educational attainment, and that Detroit's robust economic recovery has not fully closed these gaps. And then lastly, analysis of Detroit's peer cities shows signals of potential growth occupations that could be cultivated in Detroit. So as we think about how we close these disparities in access to growth occupations, especially for Black Detroiters, we know that this could go a long way towards remedying inequitable outcomes in the region. And to do this, we have to work across silos and systems to improve outcomes. There's a diverse range of types of organizations that need to intersect to address this, from employers to employees, workforce development to economic development, community partners to educational institutions. And to improve access to growth occupations, and as we think about the work of all of these different types of organizations and people, there are 3 areas that we've highlighted where we believe we can focus our efforts. First, we can continue to identify ways to increase the number of jobs in these growth occupations. By definition, these jobs are growing, but there are still opportunities to connect our business attraction strategies to industries that are still emerging in Detroit, and to focus on industries that employ a high share of Black and Latino workers in growth occupations. The second main area is talent. We need to be supporting and growing our talent so that they are well positioned to access and compete for these growth occupation jobs. This includes creating the pipeline of youth through adult workers who are aware of these growth occupations, improving educational outcomes to prepare the talent for the future, and to support our current workforce by providing training and education support so that they can move into growth occupations. The third area that we must focus on is how to ensure equitable access. The first is by identifying and creating more pathways for Detroiters without a 4-year degree to enter growth occupations. We look at some of the work done by Opportunity at Work, who you'll hear from later, and we also talk about skills-based hiring. What untapped talent do we have that can be grown from within Detroit if we were to hire based on skills rather than educational requirements where appropriate? Equally important as ensuring workers have pathways available for career growth is making sure that necessary resources are available to address barriers that prevent especially Black Detroiters and Latino Detroiters from getting hired or thriving in the roles they currently hold. 3 of the major challenges that exist in Detroit, especially for low-wage workers, are childcare, transportation, and mental health. And then lastly, we talk about the need to evaluate hiring practices. In particular, one of the key challenges for equitable participation in well-paying jobs across the country is persistent hiring discrimination. If we can start to make progress on these 3 areas, we believe that we'll be able to increase opportunities for Black and Latino Detroiters to access these growth occupations, as well as to increase opportunities to enter the middle class and to grow incomes. I'd encourage everybody to check out the report online. We have a lot more data that's featured in that report, including the full list of the 107 different growth occupations. And you can see where there are professions where there's a lot more work needed to be done. And with that, that wraps up the overview of our report. Now I'd like to welcome back Shari Williams, our engagement director, Edward Lynch, lead author of the report, and Alan Berube, our research partner at Brookings Metro, for some brief Q&A.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ashley. Wonderful presentation. So we have a couple questions coming in. Thank you, audience. Okay, so let's see what we have here. Okay, so one question we have, did you account for age discrimination that proliferates in our area? Any age discrimination data that you all looked at?
So we didn't do age discrimination as part of our analysis, although we certainly lean on some focus groups that we conducted, as well as things that we heard from focus groups that our partners with the Employment Equity Learning and Action Collaborative conducted. I think discrimination as a whole is something that is not always captured as explicitly in some of the data sources that we have, but we certainly hear from people's lived experience as something that they encounter and have to navigate as we talk about this. And so that's part of why we think it's really important that as we talk about seeing some of the disparities in the data, understanding too that there's some underlying factors as well related to discrimination, whether by race, age, physical ability, or other dimensions of identity that can impact someone's ability to be hired.
Thank you, Ashley. We have maybe another couple minutes for questions for the research team. If you have any questions, feel free to add them to the Q&A box. One person is asking, what are your thoughts on, as Detroit continues to lose population, what are your thoughts on people being trained but then relocating to other parts of the country? Any thoughts on that?
So I think that is a really important part of the conversation. So how do we make sure that we are retaining our talent here in Detroit, both in terms of when people receive skills training, I think in terms of when people are graduating from universities, we talk about that. And I think part of that is making sure that at the same time as we're talking about jobs and training, we're also creating places where people want to live and can live and thrive. And so I think as we talk about our economic development strategy, it's not just about jobs. I think this is really important. That's part of why we are here today, but it's also about creating places too, and making sure that we're creating places that can attract talent and retain talent. And in doing so, we'll attract more jobs.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ashley.
And Shari, the only thing I'd add is that
yes, please go. Please
I think this is not the only region that we go to and work with that expresses sort of similar concerns about investing in people, but maybe not being able to capture the full benefits of their increased knowledge and skills in the local labor market. And I think it speaks to the underlying, I think, rationale and principle behind all this research is that, all Detroiters, all residents of this region need to see a future for themselves in the labor market. And if they don't, they're going to go somewhere else to find that future. But if Detroit can create a high road economy that includes people from all backgrounds, all places, it greatly increases the chances that people are going to see that future here, invest in that future here, and that the region is going to capture those benefits.
Really great insights, Alan. Thank you. We have a few questions coming in. I think we may have time for a couple more questions. For the Hispanic market, did you look at language barriers? Anyone want to take that question?
Sure, I'd actually suggest you as someone who participated in the focus groups and the ways that you heard that come up.
So yes, in the focus groups, that did come up actually quite a bit. And Ashley, thank you for pointing that out. It came out quite a bit as particularly for those who speak Spanish in the region, that can be a challenge in both not only acquiring occupations in growth sectors, but also being able to advance in occupations as well. So yeah, thank you. Anybody else want to jump in? Okay. How do we make the business case for the need to how do we make the business case for the need not only for job growth, but equitable distribution across racial groups?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly what we're trying to say with this report, that there needs to be more equitable representation of people from Black and Latino communities in these growth occupations. But I think as we talk about it from the business case, and what does this mean for businesses, businesses need talent and they need workers. And I think businesses will soon, or are in the process of realizing kind of the economic imperative, right? That if we're not investing in and cultivating our Black and brown communities in terms of talent, their business needs will not be met in the future. And so I think they should have a very vested interest in how do we create these opportunities? How do we expand these trainings, education, because it's going to matter for them in terms of how they are able to staff and do their work.
Well, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you to the research team for the incredible work. Ashley, thank you for your wonderful presentation, walking us through the data. I am going to now transition us to the next part of this event, of this webinar. And I want to welcome our panel to the screen. And so quickly, I want to take a moment just to introduce our lovely panel, our brilliant panel to the screen here. First, we have Bridget Gray, who is the Chief Customer Officer with Opportunity at Work. Bridget leads the Market Development and Customer Success team as Opportunity at Work scales the hiring of workers who are skilled through alternative routes nationwide. Josh Seifman is the CEO, with Michigan Central, a 30-acre, vibrant, inclusive, and walkable community dedicated to advancing new technologies and addressing barriers to greater social, economic, and physical mobility. Taisha Wright Fraser is the President and CEO with Corporation for a Skilled Workforce. She directs the organization's overall strategic direction to provoke change in public policy and investment in workforce development. And Quentin Messer, the CEO with Michigan Economic Development Corporation, who leads business development and attraction efforts here in Michigan, with a focus on building a strong and equitable economy for all Michiganders. Welcome, each of you. Thank you so much for being here with us today and engaging us and enlightening us with all of your insights and your expertise. I'm excited to hear more about your work and looking forward to the discussion. Audience members, feel free to continue adding questions to the Q&A box if there are questions that come up for our panel. We are going to do the best we can to get through as many questions as possible. So without further ado, I want to go ahead and start off with Bridget today. And Bridget, I shared a moment ago that you lead market development and customer success to support the hiring of workers who are skilled through alternative routes nationwide. And so you all call them STARS. Could you share a little bit with us about what a STAR is and how you're working to support STARS and being able to participate in today's dynamic economy?
Absolutely. So first of all, Shari, thank you for having me. And I really appreciated hearing the report, some amazing data there. So I'll start off by just kicking off that Opportunity at Work. We're a nonprofit social enterprise working to increase economic mobility for and alongside the 70+ million STARS. That's the talent pool of U.S. workers who are skilled through alternative routes rather than a bachelor's degree. So those alternative routes could be community college, they could be a workforce training, a boot camp. And what we're doing is we're really building a business case and infrastructure for employers to implement skills-based inclusive hiring for millions of STARS to access higher wage jobs. Our work includes leading research, a national awareness campaign on STARS called Tear the Paper Ceiling, and then StellarWorks, which is our STAR-specific talent marketplace platform that is active in Detroit. Some of the ways that we've been working with employers, but also thinking about how we're aiding and eliminating disparities in access to quality employment and growth occupations has been, we know that STARS have skills for higher wage work, but they are systemically shut out by the paper ceiling. And just thinking about some of the data between 2012 and 2019, 69% of new jobs created were in occupations which typically require a bachelor's degree or higher for entry, even when there are ways to acquire the relevant skills. And then we also think about other data, which is that 69% of jobs that require those degrees, it left only 31% of new jobs available to 50% of the workforce who are stars. And so when we think about the 150 million workers in the US, 50% of the 140 million workers in the US, 50% of those workers do not possess a bachelor's degree. So when positions are being posted, we're leaving out half of the country. And it also greatly impacts, as we heard in the report, Black and Hispanic workers. And so as a result, the wage gap between stars and workers with a bachelor's degree has doubled over the last 40 years. And now stars earn less when you adjust for inflation than they did in 1976. This not only hurts stars who can translate their learning into earning, but it also hurts employers who are in desperate need of talent.
Wow, incredible work, Bridget. If you could, in a couple of minutes, could you share a little bit more about where you're specifically seeing successes for stars with accessing quality employment, and where you're seeing successes that could possibly be leveraged here in Detroit to support Detroiters' access to growth occupations?
Yeah, great question. So in 2020, we published a research report that identified and quantified for the first time the 292 jobs achieved through promising pathways to upward mobility for stars. And between stars' low wage, which we call origin, and higher wage, which are destination jobs, destination roles, jobs on these pathways, there were 51 gateway jobs. Those are those kind of middle skill jobs that can really play a pivotal role in enabling stars to translate their learning into greater earning. In addition, in 2022, we also published a report that found that over the last 20 years, stars were displaced from 7.4 million middle and high wage jobs. Nearly half of the 7.4 million jobs lost to stars since the turn of the century were in 30 occupations. And so stars currently comprise at least 20% of workers in each of these occupations, suggesting that by sourcing stars for these jobs, employers can really make deliberate choices to reverse the decline in economic mobility for stars while also strengthening their talent pipelines. So within Detroit specifically, we found that 56% of workers are stars. And two of the top 3 in-demand roles that we have looked at for stars right now are computer scientists and web developers and software developers. Collectively, when you look at the Detroit region, there are 20,000 open roles in these positions. And we know that these positions are on the high wage side because they can earn up to or more than $100,000 a year. But 34% of computer scientists and web developers are stars, yet only 29% of those postings for those roles do not require a bachelor's degree. So you have postings in Detroit by some major top employers, but we don't see the percent of stars in those roles that could actually do those jobs. And then when you start to look at software developers, only 11% of software developers are stars, with 69% of the postings requiring a bachelor's degree. Some of the top companies in the area, you've got your General Dynamics and Deloitte, Microsoft, of course, GM, Accenture. A lot of those companies are posting positions without bachelor's degree. As a matter of fact, I think the number is like 31% of those postings do not require a degree. But when you look again at software developers, only 11% of software developers are stars. So there's a gap that we can make up there. And it's a good data point for employers to realize they're already doing some work with stars. They just don't know that.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Bridget. Incredible work, so important. And thank you so much for sharing with us today. Kaisha, let's have you go next. Could you take a moment to introduce yourself, a little bit about the Corporation for a Skilled Workforce to the audience, and tell us what things you're seeing that is happening to eliminate disparities in accessing quality employment and growth occupations.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thanks so much again, Shari and Anika, for inviting me to the conversation. Always happy to get back to Michigan via Zoom or in person, having lived there for about 10 years. CSW is a 30-plus-year national workforce policy research and systems change nonprofit. We are headquartered in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Our mission is to catalyze change in educational and labor market systems to increase economic mobility, particularly for people of color and those historically excluded from opportunities. We worked across all 50 states with government, business, education, and community service providers and partners focusing on scalable improvements in worker skills and job quality. And specifically, we do this through 5 strategy areas through a culturally responsive lens, and that's competencies and credentials, federal, state, and local systems change, improving organization practices and outcomes, research and evaluation, and trauma and resilience at work. And so as we think about eliminating disparities in access to high growth occupations, I think it's first to give some important context and ask, how did we get here? And then develop the use of strategies made to target them for change. It's not happenstance that people systemically got left out and left down. And so the report does speak to some of that. And I just want to emphasize some of that here, that the workplace remains deeply segregated by occupation. Workers of color tend to be crowded in lower paying and lower opportunity, while white workers are overrepresented in many higher growth occupations, even when you account for education, as Ashley noted earlier. Then there's the geographic divide. Most of us have heard about growing up on the other side of the tracks, no matter where you live. And it seems that every city has some version of that. Detroit has a city suburban divide between Black and white residents, often rooted in white flight. And then that leads to differences in public and private investments and access to social capital. This then leads to racial inequalities in wealth, with some having less capital to make personal investments, to purchase homes, for training, which is critical, reliable transportation, which is also critical. And so we also know Detroit has some of the highest car insurance rates in the nation, which can lead to driving without insurance, which can also then lead to jail or starts incurring lots of debt for individuals. Then there's also a disproportionate amount of policing and prosecution for Black residents. And in Wayne County, Black residents are about 3.5 times more likely to be arrested than white residents. So having that context in mind, I think, is important. In any research we do, we want to bring that context to bear first before we go into what some of the issues are. You have to understand that first to figure out to address the issues and come up with strategies. And so some quick examples of how CSW then is working to eliminate these disparities is through our Credentials as You Go work. And this work focuses on changing the way we acknowledge skill and work and worth, and how businesses identify talent. And not just at the entry level. Currently, 17% of Michiganders have a BA, and that's comparable to the report for stats for Black working age Detroiters, compared to 36% for white adults. If a position requires a degree, that would exclude over 80% of the population. We need a system that recognizes that many types of credentials, and that come from certificates, industry certifications, licenses, badges, micro-credentials. There's a lot of different types of credentials out there beyond a BA, and they're worth something. And that credentials are awarded by many types of providers, not just universities. There are technical colleges, employers, there's the military. So we're testing this incremental credentialing framework in Colorado, New York, and North Carolina right now. And then we're leading these national discussions about non-degree credentials across the country. Essentially, this work calls for a nationally recognized incremental credentialing system to validate uncounted learning that allows people to be recognized for what they know and what they can do. And for employers to really start thinking about the qualifications needed to perform a job. Degree attainment isn't the only indicator of what someone knows and what they can do. There's talent out there. Employers just need to evaluate what's needed and how do they really identify that. I have time just to give one other quick example. Within Alabama, we worked in that state to develop their talent triad, which is really a piece of work where we've developed 350 job profiles, again, retooling them to focus on competencies instead of degrees, so they can look at those in-demand jobs and who can then qualify for those, again, to fuel their economy forward. So we have to just really think about qualifications differently, look at credentials beyond degree, and then also for those who can't get to the level of degree yet, we know Detroit has promise programs for students who graduate, and that's helpful for students who are able to get that high school diploma. But there's a host of people. There's 65% rate of or graduation rate in Detroit right now. What about the folks who don't have a diploma or GED? You need to focus on that population. And there's some innovative work that we're doing as well with Ability to Benefit, where we're piloting using College Promise funding to support folks who don't have that high school diploma into getting those first 6 credit hours. Once that's done, then they're eligible for financial aid, for federal financial aid like Pell Grants. And that would open the door for many Black, Hispanic workers within Detroit and across the country.
Definitely. Thank you, Kaisha. Tons of information, great insights. Quentin, I want to shift over to you and love to hear more. If you can take a moment to share with the audience what Michigan Economic Development Corporation is up to and what efforts are being made in the Detroit region specifically to eradicate inequities and access to quality employment and growth occupations as well.
Well, good afternoon. Hey, thanks for the opportunity. I mean, I thought Detroit, Future City liked me. You had me come after all this brilliance, so that wasn't really kind of you to do me that way, but that's life in the big city. Look, and the study and the presentations have been provocative, inspiring, and challenging. Let me maybe focus on just very briefly who we are at MEDC. We have to be agnostic. We're a part of state government. I serve a part of Governor Whitmer's cabinet, and we have to be agnostic across 83 counties on both peninsulas. So for those of you in the Detroit region, or in the city of Detroit, we are to the state of Michigan what the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation is to Detroit. And so we are always thinking about ways to accelerate economic opportunity, entrepreneurship in the service of ultimately growing population. And 2 quick things that I want to focus on. When I look at the 107 growth occupations and then the top growth occupations, I would argue 40% registered nurses, elementary school teachers, sales representatives of services, and loan officers are areas of growth that are a function of population growth. And I think one of the panelists we heard this, or one of the questions previously was, how do you retain population? How do you attract population? And I would argue some of the growth or lack thereof is a function of, if our population doesn't grow, well, then you're not going to have the need for healthcare. You're not going to have the need for new school facilities, things of that nature that leads to at least 40% of that. So I just want to flag that. And then I also want to flag maybe 2 quick points before I turn it back over to you. Detroit is Michigan's global brand. It's its most international city. It's one of 3 border crossings in Michigan. So I think there's an opportunity for us to get back to who Detroit was in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, in the sense that it was a place that attracted people from all over the world. I think it's ironic that you've got Josh coming up, because the symbolism of what they've done with Michigan Central speaks to that. And back then, it was a beacon of hope of going into the mobility sector, or the automotive sector. Now it's a symbol of mobility and hope of going into the 21st century mobility, innovation, creativity. Those things are where you're going to see growth. And I think undergirding all that is this notion that Governor Whitmer is certainly, and Lieutenant Governor Gilchrist, are focused on creating a state of lifelong learners. And what you see is creating opportunities for people to learn in different modalities at different stages. And I think that we have to do that. So let me just give you 2 examples of what you've seen from policy. 60 by 30 program. 60% of all Michiganders by 2030 will have either an associate degree of some form of commercially viable and recognized certification. And then future for frontliners. If this tragedy of the pandemic has taught us nothing, is that a lot of Black and brown people, and I would argue women of all races, candidly, are in pandemic or automation vulnerable jobs. And we have to move them, should they want to occupations that are going to be more resilient to technological change. We're endeavoring to do that. I wish I had more time to get into some of the specifics of what we're doing, but we know that Detroit, as Detroit goes, Michigan goes. Because as much as we love a lot of other places, when people think about Michigan, they think of through the lens of Detroit. It's the city they see when they're watching the NFL, Major League Baseball, NBA, or the NHL. When the Lions, and I think the Lions are going to make the playoffs, parenthetically, when we see more games for the Lions, we're going to see the Detroit skyline. And I think that's going to be critically important for all of us in Michigan to rally behind. And just one last point of thought. I thought it was fascinating that the 3 other cities selected was Atlanta, Indianapolis, and Columbus. I want to note that those cities are cities in which you have both the political and commercial capital of the state in the same city. We don't have that in Michigan. I think that's something to think about. Thank you.
Thank you, Quentin. Josh, I'm going to hand it over to you. As a local employer, could you take a moment to share with the audience a bit about Michigan Central and the work you're leading to intentionally hire Detroiters?
Yeah, thank you, Shari, and Ashley and Anika and the whole DFC team for including me and for this amazing work. And Quentin, I'm sort of inclined to let you just keep going about Michigan Central. So I guess I would start by saying, so we're more than an employer, and at Michigan Central, while we're anchored around the former train station as the sort of physical center point, we're really striving to build what we describe as a community building solutions and skills at the intersection of mobility and society. And what does that mean? That means that we are focused on, one, creating what I would describe as a world-leading cluster of companies, entrepreneurs, thinkers, doers, you name it, institutions, organizations, all focused on the future directions of mobility, and particularly what at this intersection of mobility and society, meaning how do we sort of advance new solutions into the real world. Secondly, we're also focused on how do we actually accelerate the adoption of new solutions into the real world. And so that means we're not just building a community of companies and others, but we're actually actively helping with pilots and testing and other work that can help really advance things in a quicker way. And then third, we have a belief that by doing those two things, we're creating a very unique opportunity to understand how to create the kinds of skills training to prepare people for the jobs that all of this can generate. And so some of it is literally on site and in the work that we're actually doing and companies are doing here at Michigan Central. But we also think that we can take the learnings from here and scale that through curriculum and whatever other mechanisms, so that it's not just about what's happening in our physical boundaries. To Quentin's point and the point made through the Q&A about growth, one way that ultimately we'll want to measure the success of Michigan Central is the extent to which we can start to shift that dynamic of talent getting training here and leaving. And so it's both job growth, but then it's also the ability to sort of really shift that paradigm and pull talent in and train talent here and keep it. So to get to your question, Shari, at Michigan Central, we're very intentionally building our approach to how we think about skills training. And we take a holistic view where we're really thinking about from K through 12, really more at currently at the high school level, but all the way through to accreditation, certification, and degrees and advanced degrees. And so we're at the early days for us, but I will say already, we've already got a community of companies here. We've already got them at the table with us, defining what are the skills that they need, how do they look for those skills, and how they can also participate in the development of curriculum. We've got early stage programs, for example, working with partners, in some cases corporate partners like a Google, where their Code Next program, which we host on site, we've worked with them to now where 90% of the students are Detroit high school kids, and then we have other programs that we're starting to develop, frankly, with Quentin and the state, partners at the city, where we can focus on different levels of talent. But you know, we're at the forefront of defining what those jobs looking forward will be. And so when we think about growth jobs, you know, you have the line item around software engineers, which is, you know, certainly a ton of our work touches on that category. But there's other dimensions too that we're starting to see. And so if you think about the implications of electrification, if you think about the implications of alternative energies, if you think about, I know there's been a lot of conversations in the chat about drones, you know, what Michigan Central represents is the opportunity to think holistically about it. So for example, you know, we already have a number of companies around advanced aerial mobility. That's not just the drones, but think about what's the technology that's gonna allow them to function in an urban context. What's the policy layers that lets it do it? And there's a whole array of skills and jobs that come out of that holistic view. So I'll shut up there, but long answer to a short question, but that's how we're thinking about it at Michigan Central.
Thank you, Josh. I appreciate that, your perspective and the work that you're doing to intentionally bring these opportunities to Detroiters. So thank you so much for the work you do and for sharing. Audience, we are going to transition to our open Q&A from the audience. So continue to put your questions in the Q&A box. There are tons of questions in here though, so I'm not sure how many we'll get through. But as we begin the transition, Bridget, I do want to come back to you. I think it'd be great to hear if you could share a little bit with us about how you're working with employers to improve the values of STARS in the workforce, and what successes can you point to?
Oh yeah, great question. So one of the things we really believe firmly is that we have to build a business case for STARS. It's not easy for an employer to pivot their thought processes, especially when they're posting positions which are heavily degree required. So employers, we're building this business case that STARS are a skilled talent category alongside college graduates. We feel like that's the first step towards making STARS an explicit part of a company's talent strategy. And then also, just as digital transformation has required businesses to reimagine their infrastructure, we're building the infrastructure to drive 21st century inclusive hiring. And so this new infrastructure that we've been building, it includes data and technology platforms, as well as new practices and processes for sourcing, hiring, and developing STARS talent. We work really closely with employers to really help them understand how they tag jobs specifically for STARS. It's not enough to remove a degree requirement. You have to actually be very intentional about how you're tagging that job for a STAR. And so we work with employers in employer practice change and advising them. We have 3 categories that we really think about when an employer is STAR ready, they're ready to hire, or maybe they're just STAR aware and they understand what skills-based hiring is, but they don't know necessarily how to do that. And they need to cascade those decisions across the organization to tag jobs for skills-based hiring and for STARS. We actually advise those employers in how to do that and how to get that buy-in intentionally. And then our solutions, they help move stakeholders from intent to action and offer systems that make it easier to manage hiring workflows. So I mentioned earlier about one of our flagship solutions is StellaWorks, which is specifically designed for STARS. It's a skills-based talent marketplace. It is a one-stop shop, so employers have an ability to scale inclusive hiring and supporting those STARS, as well as the training providers that are helping STARS build on their skills and moving them into these middle wage and greater mobility career pathways. And the work that we're doing is not here to replace or compete with solutions that other workforce organizations are doing. Instead, we see our work as supportive. It's in helping to enable these tools that will add value to the work that folks are already doing. So we see our role as a catalyst, and we are helping employers and policymakers really understand how they can operate and implement a STARS-focused talent strategy. And then we also welcome opportunities to collaborate in that space. And then over the last 3 years, we've successfully onboarded 150 employers who have tagged jobs for STARS, 175 talent developers who are actually doing the training of STARS, and over 3,000 STARS have actually joined the StellarWorks platform. And then just last year, we partner really closely with the state of Maryland in its first of a kind partnership, where they dropped degree requirements across an entire state and posted those jobs in our StellarWorks talent matching platform. And in Maryland, between May of and August of 2022, I think the state hired over 1,800 people who didn't have 4-year degrees. That was a 41% increase year over year, compared to 14% year over year increase in hiring for all workers. So we know that when we're intentional and we're intentionally working with employers, we can see the increase in their ability to tap STARS. And then last fall, we launched the Tear the Paper Ceiling campaign, which is a nationwide PSA in partnership with the Ad Council. And it's supported by 50 plus national organizations, including Google and IBM and Accenture, Walmart, to support STARS as a talent category, but also support in hiring. And so those are some of the things we're working with, and we're working with employers in Detroit directly to do this work. And so we welcome the partnership and collaboration from Area Detroit and folks that are here on this call to push more STARS into jobs, into higher wage jobs.
Yes, exactly. I like how you ended that. Thank you so much, Bridget. Incredible work. So we have a few questions here for you all. I'm gonna post this question, and then if anyone feels compelled to just come off mute and answer, feel free. But where are you seeing the most success in workforce development, and what processes and program structures are most effective or show the most promise?
And I'll try to, again, I know that a couple of things that we have launched in partnership with Michigan Work and regional and local partners in Metro Detroit is really to try to make sure that talent is prepared for opportunities that are happening because of technological transition, whether it's the transition from the internal combustion to electric vehicle or other propulsion systems, or is it making sure that we can develop charging infrastructure and make sure battery storage and all those other what must be truths as we see large scale adoption. I think that's why it's critically important that we have this asset, Michigan Central. And I'm not saying that the world is going to be solved by Michigan Central's success, but what it does suggest is that when we work together and make sure that we have people prepared for opportunities, not just today, but 10, 15, 20 years from now. What does that mean? We need to make sure that we have people and our friends and neighbors, and more importantly, the next generation. So that's why we need to make sure that we're working with our pre-K through 3 and 12 systems and make sure that they are educating young people with skills and thought processes of relevance so they can color the canvases of their imagination, because that is what's going to make you able to deal with the fact that drone technology is going to fundamentally change the way the package is delivered. I think I saw that in one of the chat functions. We know that automation is something, and one of the results that we saw in the pandemic, and because we have low labor force participation rates, is that companies are beginning to think creatively, how can I do the same amount of work with fewer people? And so we need to be thinking through, and that's what we've done. Just one last brag point that Team Michigan is that we recently launched the largest effort in America to fill in-demand roles, electrical engineer, software developer, production workers, and frontline supervisors by incenting 2- and 4-year college graduates. And we will also work with people who have alternative certificates. But I think we also need to be sanguine to help people understand how to translate that. And I would say that, with artificial intelligence potentially becoming a screener of resumes, One of the great opportunities for opportunity at work and Corporation for a Skilled Workforce is to help these AI formulations to prepare and identify people who don't look traditional. But I would still suggest, and people may disagree, the dominant pathway is going to be, sadly, whether we want to admit it or not, to look as traditional as we can, particularly for people of color, particularly for men of color. I'm not accepting that as a reality. I'm just suggesting, of my 54 years of walking the earth, that tends to be the reality. And so we have to be able to have an and strategy, not an or strategy. And I'm encouraged by what I hear today is the support of that and not an or strategy.
Can I jump in on that for a second? So I love that, Quentin. It is a both and, right? It has to be. There are just positions in this country that are going to require a 4-year degree. We know that is just truth, but it is a both and I tend to be a little bit more optimistic that we are going to move employers towards skills-based hiring for roles that they do not need a 4-year degree. That it takes intentionality. There's a lot of work that has to happen with that. It's not easy. And so getting an employer there is going to take work, but it's also going to take the work of workforce organizations. Workforce organizations, I come from workforce organizations. So I come from Europe and for Scholas, and so I understand that work. One of the things that's really, really important is workforce organizations really have to dig themselves into the data and really understanding the same data that labor market data that employers are looking at. They have to ingrain themselves in it, but also bringing employers to the table when they're developing curriculum is really important, because you start to think about, where do we build this skills bank and this competency bank where we have an aligned language around what skills and competencies look like? When you think about a software developer, you can go to 10 companies, they're all going to give you different skill sets that they need, but there has to be a foundation of skills that are needed that every single company needs. And community colleges are amazing places for training to happen, but how do we support community colleges? And then how do we support workforce organizations that can actually align with community colleges and how they're teaching? So I'm just extremely passionate about that, because I want us to move employers to skills-based hiring. I see some of them doing it now. We just need to close that gap.
All right, could I add one thing just to build on what Bridget's saying? We've been very focused on trying to build curriculum around what we're calling innovation competencies, and it's in addition to technical skills, it's the ability, for example, to adapt to change in technology quickly, and to sort of understand how to also collaborate across disciplines or skill sets, and it's a little bit around. While it's maybe not about hard skills, it's an incredibly important piece for, I think, also resilience in the workplace. And so I'm sort of fascinated. I'm not a workforce development professional like my colleagues on the panel. I love hearing that they're sort of thinking about that, because we see that as an incredibly important area of growth and something that companies can be very helpful in forging.
Make one comment as well. I think as we get to, it needs to be across the board, looking across the workforce ecosystem place. And I think Quentin was starting there as well. We have to start early. It's not once the person is ready to work, how do we think about the barriers along the way? And, it's Women's History Month and International Women's History Day. So I couldn't be remiss to think about a lot of work that is tied to gender or legacy of freed labor, particularly for Black women, when we think about childcare workers in that broken system, and also the inability for people to get quality childcare so they can work, and that does inhibit a lot of women from entering the workplace. And so I really like the idea of the origin jobs that was brought up in the report, but really thinking about how these jobs can be connected to other and lattice to other careers as a bridge to other high-paying jobs. So when we think about early childhood education careers that are like $11 an hour, how do we get them to the $25 an hour of a public school teacher, and think about those things? So also just the other barriers that are in place along the way that prevent somebody the cost of education, like I just mentioned earlier, justice impacted backgrounds. You know, a lot of the high growth occupations, not a lot, there were some like finance or healthcare. There are some jobs that are just barred from folks having a criminal background, and we need to be upfront and think about where we positioning people and what are the other options for people so that they're not frustrated once they get to that point and realize it might not be an option for them. So I do love the origin jobs, but how do we bolster them to lead to greater opportunities, and also look at how do we alleviate barriers along the way for individuals?
Oh, I love that. I love all of it. Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful responses. I have another question here. I appreciate the review of growing occupations in other metro areas and the lessons we might learn as a result. What about future trends in technology, and how might that affect jobs of the future? I think there is an equity lens that could be applied now to help us prepare for a different set of jobs than those that exist today that Detroiters could fill. Any thoughts on that? Anyone want to jump in?
I mean, I'll kick it. Go ahead. I'll kick it off. I think some of it is really, I think there are three big picture things. One, at least asking a question. So I think that if nothing else, this symposium, the work that Detroit Future City did, the research asked the question. So there's now an intentional conversation that's been catalyzed to think about this. The second thing is we need to think about those things that what I would call are timeless, regardless of the technology, whether it was moving from the buggy whip to the Model T, to the Mach T, to, you know, Tesla, to the electric Bronco, whatever it might be. Pick your favorite through line just in mobility, for example. What are the things that we know are always timeless and true? Creativity, problem solving, resiliency and grit, you know, the ability to sort of communicate, especially with people who are different, the management of emotions. There are no difference between hard and soft skills. They're just skills for being a well-adjusted human being. And I think especially in this era, where I would argue the greatest existential challenge facing America is mental health, especially we need to make sure that young folks, especially young folks of color, can manage and deal with trauma early and have that in their DNA, because there's going to be trauma along the journey for everybody, every human being, but especially for folks of color. And the earlier that they can learn to do that and not have that first experience in a workplace setting, I think the better. But, you know, you're never going to be able to automate creativity. You're never going to be able to automate the ability to collaborate and communicate with people who are different from you. So I think if we focus on those skills very early on, pre-K 3 through 12, inculcate it, allow people to have different ways to get back on and off tracks, depending on life circumstances, I think we in Michigan, in Detroit, in Michigan, and society will be better.
Did anyone else want to speak to that? If not, that's fine, because I think there's a really great transition question to follow your response, Quentin. And this is kind of a combination of a question that's in the chat and just kind of building on what you just said, but recognizing the intersecting barriers and challenges that exist for many Detroiters and for all of us, right? Like you said, Quentin, but specifically for Detroiters, what has programming looked like as it relates to wraparound supports and services? Are there specific things that we can point to, or are there, if you can't really speak to that, are there conversations being had around incorporating some of those mental health supports into some of the wraparound supports that are being built into programming efforts? So that was a lot, but anyone want to jump in response to that?
I'll go ahead. And I think I mentioned some of this already with some of the major barriers today related to justice impacted backgrounds, which can bar folks, although there is 2022 Fair Hiring Acts that are narrowing what can be considered and what's not barred in the financial industry, which will have great implications for workers. Of course, childcare, and then I mentioned transportation. As we know, a lot of the growth occupations are outside or out of reach for Detroit residents. So again, access around those jobs is going to be critical. And that could be other barriers as simply, as I mentioned, a license and the policing related to that, which could bar somebody from getting a license because of fees. So there are a lot of things, I think, just to get to some of those root causes that prevent people, the cost of education. Definitely think trauma is a big one. And one of the things we've done, and not just for individuals too, but for staff, I think sometimes we overlook teachers, educators, workforce service providers. And we've been doing various staff trainings for workforce professionals in the state, within the city as well, so that they understand in the ways that they can integrate that into their service delivery as they're helping residents, and also dealing with their own trauma. It's a lot when you're hearing this all the time, you internalize some of that. So how do they even work through some of that so that they can better serve customers? But I think it really, again, takes that comprehensive system of thinking about the various barriers that occur for someone as early as childhood, with childcare, all the way up to adulthood, and where do workforce services, businesses, education all work together and intersect to support workers along their journey and entrance into work.
And I was just jumping to say, language is really powerful in how we describe certain things, right? And so I will just say it openly, I hate the term wraparound supports because it segments stars from everybody else, right? When you think about a business, part of a business's benefits package are wraparound supports. There are things like transportation that businesses will offer to their staff, transportation reimbursement. There are things like childcare. You see businesses that actually put childcare into their business. And so stars are no different than anyone else in this country on what they need. Most businesses have an employee assistance program. If you are struggling financially or if you are struggling with mental health, you can go through your employee assistance program to get the support you need. And so I think it's really important to help employers, which is part of the conversation we have with them, is don't think just because someone comes through what you deem as a non-traditional pathway, they're different from the very employees that are in your business every day. It's the way that we talk about people that make it seem like stars are an anomaly, that they're just really different. So language is really, really powerful. And so when we're talking to employers, we talk about these as part of the benefits package. What are the things that you're offering? How are you making the supports? And then we talk to stars and coach them on, these are the benefits that companies actually offer. These are the things you have to be thinking about and advocating for yourself and why they matter. But I just wanted to say that because there is this correlation of taking people that come through a non-traditional pathway and creating a space as if they're very different from people who go to work every day. And that's just not the case.
Yeah. Powerful points, two small points. I mean, from a state policy perspective, the governor and legislature created regional child care planning grants, and they're working with the Early Childhood Investment Corporation. And I think you'll see under this legislature and this governor expansion of the Tri-Share program, which is a program where you have, the employer pays 1/3 of childcare, the state, and then the employee. But we know that one gating item is the lack of qualified workers to actually provide the childcare. And we're seeing pilots, most notably in the UP and Marquette County, to try to create an incubator of childcare providers and childcare centers as entrepreneurial ventures as well. So obviously a lot of work to be done, but those it's not lost on the administration. And I think those are things that as we work together, you'll probably see in greater force in the Detroit metro area.
Wonderful. Before we wrap up this segment, I do want to ask the group here, for the practitioners that are in our audience right now that are working, doing workforce development, trying to lead these efforts and working themselves to eliminate disparities and access to quality jobs. From your respective expertise and experiences, could you share a bit about where you see really great examples that folks could point to or look to inform how we can move this work forward here in Detroit?
Sure, examples around the work that employers are doing to support the work. Is that what you're asking?
Work that employers, workforce development agencies across the country, are there specific partnerships that work really well? Are there conversations folks should be having that maybe we aren't thinking about? What type of collaborations might we need to move this work forward? Just any insights you may have within your respective area of expertise.
One of the things I dropped in the chat was that we recently created a regional dashboard. And it is one that anyone in Detroit can go to and look at the Detroit region to see what employers are doing the most hiring of stars, how many employers are actually removing degree requirements. We say that because it's important to arm yourself with the data so that when you are talking to an employer, you can use their data with them. And so I think, again, it's really important for the alignment to happen around workforce. And so we've been developing some really amazing partnerships in Detroit. We've been working with Accenture, who is really amazing around their apprenticeship model. Apprenticeships are awesome. And so we've been really stacking hands with them around what apprenticeships will look like. So that's just one thing I will just drop, is that arming yourself with the data is really important, and being able to see what skills employers are actually asking for that are most in demand. That's what StellarSite does. It gives you those skills, and then how do you actually align with an employer to teach towards those skills and to build that specific curriculum?
Yeah, I would shout out the W.K. Kellogg Foundation as being a leader in pushing certainly MEDC's thinking, I would say policymakers, not only across Michigan, but nationally in this. They alone will not be able to solve it, but they have put their money where their mouth is to begin to try to model and pilot best practices. I also think that you're seeing a focus, whether it's Henry Ford Community College or Wayne County Community College, really leaning in and engaging on these matters. I think there's a chance for Michigan, and particularly Metro Detroit region, to be an example. But let's not kid ourselves. Regrettably, no one has cracked the code on this. So I don't think we should be discouraged and think, oh, somebody is so far ahead and they have. No, it's been elusive. It's been challenging. It's been maddeningly difficult. But so I think we are as well positioned as any. But I think we need to shout out and celebrate the W.K. Kellogg Foundation and other foundations in the Detroit metro area who have, whether it's Kresge or the Wilson Foundation and others, and, who have been supportive of this work.
I'll quickly add to that. You're talking about funders. The Michigan Justice Fund as well, they're really looking into how do we prepare folks who are incarcerated or out of incarceration into their next steps in life. And so we're working closely with them to think about how do we remove some of those barriers. And also Hope Starts Here, again, thinking about childcare opportunities, good quality childcare, and also opportunities for childcare workers to advance up that ladder so that they have good quality jobs and self-sufficiency for themselves and their own families.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I just want to, I want to go ahead and close this segment out. We are almost at the end of this webinar. So this was a wonderful conversation, great resources, amazing work that you all are doing and leading, and so important. So I just want to thank you once again. Thank you to the audience for joining us to learn more about the report findings. I hope that as you're leaving this event today, you are leaving inspired. We are definitely excited to learn how you all use this information in your work to continue advancing economic equity and improving Detroiters' access to opportunity and growth occupations as well. Later on this year, we do intend to hold a symposium that is centered around employment equity, and we hope to continue the conversation there as well on this topic. So please stay tuned to and continue to follow Detroit Future City to learn more about that. Before we completely close out today, I just want to remind you all, we do have hard copies of the report, so feel free to place a request for that and we'll be happy to mail it out to you. Additionally, there is a survey. We love to continuously improve our events and our engagement, so please take about a minute of your time to complete that survey to help us continuously improve our events. And lastly, if there are any questions that arise or anything that comes up for you after this event concludes, feel free to reach out to me, or there's also an email address here on the screen, info@Detroit Future City, and we'd be happy to engage with you there as well. Aside from that, I thank you again all for joining us today, and everyone have a wonderful rest of your week. Bye.
Thank you.